Okay, so yesterday, we brought down the source in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the early Talmudic sages that recorded the entire oral tradition. And you know what? I didn't use this yesterday, but I'll use it today. The source sheet, I think over here, for this Sicha specifically, especially, it would be very helpful because it's all about the specific text and the textual changes and differences. So I think it would be very helpful actually to use this. Now my little Mendel over here, he colored a little bit on the screen, but you guys can't see that, right? It doesn't share what I can see. It shares from the actual computer screen. Okay, that's good. Yeah,
I thought you meant he underlined highlighted the links there. I said, boy, he did a good job there.
Oh no. This is his favorite. I'm trying to teach him where the toys are in the playroom, but for him the rest of the house is his toys in his playroom.
And my kids were like that. We got them all the toys, and they'd go in and get the pots and pans from under the sink, and that would be their toy in the middle of the kitchen.
He loves it. Takes him literally 30 seconds when I'm out looking to tell you, bring the chair to where the desk, climb on top of the chair, from the chair on top of the desk, and then he can access the markers, he can access the screen, he can have a lot of fun. Okay, anyways, getting back to what we're doing. So you're able to see over here. So we have over here, we'll start with the Mishnah. Here's the Mishnah over here. The Mishnah on the Tractate Pesachim, right? The Tractate of Pesach. It says like this. In each and every generation, a person must view himself as though he personally left Egypt, as it is stated, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of this which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. In every generation, each person must say, this is what the Lord did for me, and not this which the Lord did for my forefathers. It's not what God did for my forefathers, it's what the Lord did for me, which means that I have to feel like I left Egypt. Okay, so that's the Mishnah in the Tractate of Pesachim. Then we go to the second source, which is the Rambam Maimonides. He was the first one to codify the entire Talmud. And he writes over here, this is the Rambam in the section of halachas of chametz and matzah, which deals with all the halachas of Pesach, chapter 7, halacha 6. He says like this, in each and every generation, a person must present himself as if he himself has now left the slavery of Egypt. As the verse states, he took us out from there. Regarding this manner, God commanded in the Torah, remember that you were a slave, i.e. as if you yourself were a slave and went out to freedom and were redeemed. So if you don't look too closely at it, it looks like it's the same thing as what we just read in the Mishnah, that you have to view yourself as if you left Egypt, and we bring a verse from the Torah to prove it. And then we go on to the Alter Rebbe, who codified later. After the Rambam, there was the first code of Jewish law made by the Rabbi Yosef Karo. But on that, there were many commentaries who agreed and disagreed and discussed more things and added more things. So the Alter Rebbe felt the need to again codify the code of Jewish law based on all of the previous codifications, which had a bunch of disagreements to lay down the final law. So the Alter Rebbe writes over here. This is in chapter 472, section 7. It says like this, one should prepare a place to sit so that he will be able to recline in a manner that reflects freedom, as kings and men of great stature do while eating. The underlying rationale for this practice is that in every generation, a person is obligated to present himself as if he is now leaving the subjugation of Egypt. As implied by the verse, it is for the sake of this that God acted on my behalf when I went out of Egypt. It is with regard to this matter that the Holy One, blessed be He, commanded, and you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, i.e., it is as if you yourself were a slave in Egypt and were redeemed and granted freedom. Therefore, one must carry out all the practices of this night in a manner that reflects freedom, as will be explained. So here we have the Alter Rebbe about this same idea, again, bringing a verse to prove that we need to feel that we're leaving Egypt. And then we asked a number of questions, small textual changes between all three of them. Okay, so we had, first of all, if we take a look at the Mishnah says a person is obligated to regard himself as if he, to regard himself, literally lirais, to see himself. Okay, so the Mishnah says you have to see yourself as if you left Egypt. Whereas the Rambam, no, I was looking in the wrong place. Okay, here it says see himself. In each and every generation, a person must view himself. Very good. Okay, over here it says view himself. Okay, whereas the Rambam, over here says in each and every generation, a person must present himself. Laharis literally means to present to others, to show others. So the Mishnah says you have to see yourself. The Rambam says you have to show others, you have to demonstrate it, you have to present yourself. And the Alter Rebbe also says that word of leharis, which, where is it over here? In each and every generation, a person is obligated to present himself. So that's the first difference. The Mishnah says you have to see yourself, whereas the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe both say you have to present yourself, meaning you have to present to others. So is it enough just to feel it yourself, or do you have to show others this feeling as well? That's the first difference. The second difference was the Mishnah says you have to view yourself as if he personally left Egypt. Okay, as he left Egypt. But then the Rambam says, yeah, a person must present himself as if he himself has now left the slavery of Egypt. It doesn't say left Egypt, this adds the word slavery. Shibun Mitzrayim, the slavery of Egypt, or the subjugation of Egypt. And the Alter Rebbe also writes, a person is obligated to present himself as now leaving the subjugation of Egypt. The same word, Shibun Mitzrayim. I don't know why they translate it in two different words, if it's the same Hebrew word, but it's the same idea. The slavery or the subjugation, it's synonyms. The point is that, again, we have another difference between the Mishnah versus both the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam, that the Mishnah says Egypt, and the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam say the subjugation of Egypt. Okay, so that's the second difference. The third difference is the verses. Okay, so now this time all three have different verses that are used. The verses that they prove this from, so the Mishnah uses it from the verse, each person must say, this which the Lord did for me. Wait a second. First, let's go to the first verse. First he says, as it is stated, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of this which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. That's the verse. And he points out, this is what the Lord did for me, and not what the Lord did for my forefathers. That means it's a obligation that I have to feel it, that this is what God did for me. I left Egypt. Okay, so this is the verse the Mishnah says. Then the Rambam brings out a different verse. Where's the Rambam? Okay, as the verse states, he took us out from there. So he says a different verse. He took us out from there. It's not the verse that this is what God did for me. It's a different verse. He took us out from there. And then the Rambam continues with the second verse. Regarding this matter, God commanded in the Torah, remember that you were a slave, i.e., as if you were a slave. You have to remember that you were a slave. That's a different verse. So the Rambam brings two verses. One, that he took us out from there. So that means we have to see yourself that God took us out. And second of all, remember that you were a slave. That means you have to remember that you were a slave, not just that your forefathers were a slave. Okay, so it's two different verses that the Rambam brings from the Mishnah. Now the Alter Rebbe has an interesting thing over here. The first thing he says is, where is it? Here, as implied by the verse, it is for the sake of this that God acted on my behalf when I went out of Egypt. Okay, that's a brand new verse. It doesn't say this in the Mishnah. No, wait a second. It does say this in the Mishnah. Wait a second. It says this in the Mishnah. Where's the Mishnah? Yeah, it says in this Mishnah. It is because of this, right here in the Mishnah. It's because of this which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. So the first thing the Alter Rebbe says is it quotes the verse from the Mishnah. It's because of this that God did for me when I left out of Egypt. Okay? Then the Alter Rebbe continues, it is with regard to this matter the Holy One best way he commanded, and you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Then the Alter Rebbe continues with the second verse, and this time he's quoting the second verse that the Rambam says. You have to remember that you were a slave. The Mishnah doesn't say a second verse. The Mishnah just says that first verse. The Rambam brings two verses, and the second verse that you remember that you were a slave, the Alter Rebbe quotes that second verse also. So we have the Mishnah quotes one verse, the Rambam quotes two different verses. The Alter Rebbe quotes first the verse the Mishnah says, and then quotes the second verse of the Rambam. So we have three different changes in the verses that are being brought as a proof for this idea. So that's the third question on the third changes in the text between the three sources of law. Okay, so that's our questions. So now to answer it, we started explaining that what's happening over here, if we want to break it down and simplify things, there's four distinct ideas that are being brought out in this law. Between all the various sources, there are four ideas. One idea is the reality, that the Exodus is an action that is ongoing, meaning that, as we say, if God wouldn't have taken us out of Egypt, we would still be there today. That means that this is something we are now still feeling the effects of the Exodus, still today. Right now, we're still feeling it. That's a fact. That's number one. Okay, number two, now comes an obligation. There's an obligation to feel that we left Egypt. There's a mitzvah, an obligation to feel that. This that we just said is the fact that we are still feeling the facts, the effects, of leaving Egypt. Now comes number two, we have to feel that effect. We have to feel like we are now that we are leaving Egypt. Okay, number three, another point. Not only do we have to feel it ourselves, but we have to demonstrate it. We have to show others this feeling. Okay, I have a slight feeling that my little boy just climbed on top of a table. So let me pause it for a second. So, okay, so we have to not only feel this ourselves, but we have to demonstrate it to others. That's the third point. The fourth point is that this is not only a thing that this obligation that we have to do to recite it. We have to say that we feel it, and we have to, while we're saying the Haggadah, but all the different things that we do during the Seder night is part of this obligation of demonstrating that this feeling that we're leaving Egypt, and that's we see that in the fact that the Rebbe brings us down together with all the other Seder customs of leaning, and so on. I didn't mention that there's the next halacha in the Rambam. This was halacha 6 that we quoted before, but it's a halacha 7. Goes on, therefore, when a person feasts on this night, he must eat and drink while he's reclining in the manner of free men. Each and every one, both men and women, must drink 4 cups of wine in this night. This number shall not be reduced. Even a poor person who is sustained by charity should not have fewer than 4 cups, and the size of this cup should be a quarter of a lug, certain measurement. But the point is that we see that this is something that we don't just say that we are leaving Egypt. We have to recline. We have to do things throughout the Seder to demonstrate it. Okay, so that's the 4 different distinct points that are bringing out in this law. Okay, and number one, a reality, the Exodus is ongoing. Number 2, we have an obligation to feel it that we're leaving Egypt. Number 3, an obligation to show this feeling to others and demonstrate it. Number 4, the obligation is not only to recite it, but to actually do other things during the Seder night to also demonstrate this. So now, based on this, we started explaining some of the first difference and the third difference, the difference of the verses and the difference between the seeing and showing. That's what we explained yesterday. And today we'll continue on with the second difference about the subjugation of Egypt versus just Egypt. Okay, so the difference is like this. The Mishnah quotes one verse. Again, where's the Mishnah? The Mishnah is over here. And you should tell your son on that day, saying, it's because of this which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. And in every generation, each person must say this which the Lord did for me, and not this which the Lord did for my forefathers. This is something the Torah says that you have to say to your children. This is what God did for me. Okay, so here we have the reality. That means that the reality is that this is what God did for me, not what He did for my forefathers. This is what He did for me. So here we bring out this verse supports the first point, that the reality is the Exodus is ongoing. Okay, however, it doesn't show us an obligation. We don't have a mitzvah over here. It doesn't say you should do something. Okay, it says you should go and tell your son on that day, saying, as an answer to his question, we have the 4 questions and this is the answer, but it's not a commandment that you have to go. And say this. When your son asks you these questions, you should tell him this is the reality. So that's why both the Rambam and Alter Rebbe have to quote a different verse. The different verse is, where's the Rambam? Remember that you were a slave. And the Alter Rebbe also quotes that same verse. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Here we have a commandment. We have a mitzvah telling you to do something. You have to remember this. Okay, and it's not just a reality. This is an obligation that we have to reveal this. And that's why they bring that other verse the Mishnah does not say, to bring out point number 2. Where's point number 2? Here's point number 2. There's an obligation to feel that we left Egypt. Okay, so that is the reason why the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam need to bring out that second verse. Now, then we go into the difference between seeing and feeling and showing. Seeing and showing. The Mishnah said to see, and the Alter Rebbe, the Rambam says to show. Okay, the rationale is that this obligation of feeling is actually not a Pesach obligation specifically. It's a daily obligation for every single day of the year. It doesn't say anything about Pesach in the Torah that you have to feel this. It says in general you have to feel this. That means every single day you have to feel like you left Egypt. There's a mitzvah every single day to feel it. And we do this mitzvah in the Shema. We end off the Shema speaking about the Exodus of Egypt. And that's how we remind ourselves and we feel that we left Egypt every single day of the year. So it's not a Pesach thing. So therefore, when it comes Pesach, and now on Pesach, we are supposed to tell the story over to others. As the Mishnah quotes the verse, you should tell your son. From here we see the idea of saying the Haggadah to someone else. So that means that it's not just it's not just feeling yourself anymore. There's an obligation now to demonstrate this feeling. Right? Once you already established that there's an obligation to feel it, now we can use this verse on the Mishnah and say, oh, it's not just an obligation to feel it yourself, there's an obligation to show others. You have to tell your son about this. You have to demonstrate it. You have to do things about it. Okay, and that's what leads us to the third thing. There's an obligation to demonstrate the above feeling. That's a logical conclusion after we have the reality, and we have the mitzvah of the reality. And after we have the obligation to feel they left Egypt. And once we know there's a mitzvah of the Seder to recite the story to someone else, to your son. So now comes it follows logically that, okay, it's not just it's not just saying the Haggadah, that's the mitzvah to tell your son, but the feeling that the whole idea of the Haggadah is feeling that you left Egypt. Now you have to show that feeling to your son too. Okay. So that's how we get to the third point. And then comes the fourth point. That once we're doing this by the Haggadah, it's also a logical thing. Now, once there's an obligation to show your son while you're reciting the Haggadah by Pesach, it's understandable that that's not the only thing that we're doing during the Haggadah. to show that you left Egypt. We're doing a bunch of things. We're eating matzah, we're drinking 4 cups of wine, and we're doing a bunch of things to show that we left Egypt. So that means that it's not just saying the Haggadah that we need to go and show it. It's everything that we do during the Seder night is all part of this demonstrating this feeling that we're leaving Egypt. It's all part of this mitzvah. Okay, so this leads us to the 4th point. This obligation applies to all the nights of the Pesach, not only reciting the Haggadah. And that's the reason why the Alter Rebbe omits the words you should tell your son. See, the Mishnah says you should tell your son. Where's the Mishnah? The Mishnah says you should tell your son on that day saying, right? The Alter Rebbe quotes this verse, but he omits those words of it. The Alter Rebbe only quotes it starting from the next few words. It's because of this which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt, as we see over here. As implied by the verse, it is for this sake that God acted on my behalf when I left Egypt. He doesn't say the first part, we should tell your son. Why is that? Because the words because of this is showing that's because of this. Because of what? What's the this? Because of this whole Seder that we're doing now. We're drinking the 4 cups and we're eating the matzah and everything that we're doing to remind us of the freedom. We're reclining because of this. Because of this includes everything that we're doing in the Seder night, not just reciting the Haggadah. And everything is included in this mitzvah of demonstrating that you left Egypt. If you an Alter Rebbe would have included the words you should tell your son, you might think, oh, it's the obligation is only while you're telling your son, while you're reciting the Haggadah. That's telling your son the story. But that's not the only time you have this mitzvah of demonstrating this freedom. It's also when you're not telling your son, when you're just drinking the cups, you're not saying anything, you're drinking. That's also showing your son, all right? It's also demonstrating that you left Egypt. So he doesn't say those words, you should tell your son, because then you might mistakenly think that it's only during the telling that you have this mitzvah. Okay, so that's why the Alter Rebbe uses those words. Now, regarding the difference of you should see and you should show, that the Mishnah says you should see yourself, and the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam both say you should show yourself. So the Mishnah is bringing it as a general introduction to the whole idea of the Exodus. Okay, before it even gets into any details of Pesach. In the Mishnah, where's the Mishnah over here? Okay, before it goes into all the details, it tells us in general, okay, let's say introductory passage. Every generation, you got to feel like you left Egypt. And now we can start discussing the details of the Pesach, of the Seder. But the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam both are discussing this in the midst of the laws of Pesach, in the midst of the 4 cups. It comes in continuation to once we say, oh, there's the obligation to have 4 cups of wine by the Seder, and we recline, right? So then he continues and says, once you prepare a place to sit so you can recline like free men. Why do we do this? Because in every generation you have to feel as if you're leaving Egypt. Okay, and the Rambam also. The Rambam brings this. Therefore, it's right. His point is in the next law. Therefore, you have to eat and drink, reclining, and so on. Before it gets into the reclining, it tells us in each generation you have to present himself like you're leaving Egypt. So the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe are both bringing this in the middle of the discussion of the laws of the Seder night about the reclining, whereas the Mishnah is a general introduction before it gets into the laws, and that's why the Mishnah suffices to tell us that you have to feel yourself, because it's talking about in general, every day of the year, not just the Seder night. You have to feel as if you left Egypt. But the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam are both talking about the Seder night, where it's not enough just to feel. You have to demonstrate it. The rest of the year, it's good enough to feel it. But on the Seder night, you have to demonstrate it. You demonstrate it by doing things to show that you left Egypt, by drinking the 4 cups, by reclining. And that's why it says the words to show, to present yourself, whereas the Mishnah only says to see yourself. Okay, that's what we got up to. So we answered the first question, the difference between see and present. And we answered the third question about all the different verses, why the Mishnah uses one set of verses, and the Rebbe uses the Rambam a different set, and the Rebbe a different set. Okay. Now we continue. I'm going a little bit longer today. I hope that's all right with everyone. Okay. So the law is that one must consider himself, I'm over here, as if he left Egypt now. Okay, so what does it mean to leave Egypt now? Are we talking about the physical, geographical place of Egypt? Is that what we're talking about? That can be. This cannot mean that one must feel like he just left the land of Egypt. So that's the opposite of reality. As he was not in the land of Egypt a moment prior, how could you feel like you just left the geographical place of Egypt if you were not in Egypt just now? Maybe you were never even in Egypt in your life. In fact, there's actually a mitzvah that you're not allowed to go and live in Egypt. So how could you say now that you have to feel like you just left Egypt? That doesn't make any sense. Rather, the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe therefore explain the intention is the subjugation of Egypt. We're not talking about leaving the geographical place of Egypt. We're talking about feeling that we're leaving the subjugation of Egypt. We have to feel like we're not slaves anymore. That's the point. The Mishnah just says Egypt. But the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe have to explain the Mishnah, have to explain what it means. When the Mishnah says Egypt, it doesn't mean the geographical place of Egypt. It's referring to the subjugation of Egypt, the slavery of Egypt. That's what we have to feel like that we're leaving. And that's why they add that word as an explanatory word to explain the word Egypt in the Mishnah. It's not talking about the place, it's talking about the slavery of Egypt. Okay. So that answers the second question. Oh, now going back to, I guess we didn't finish the third question. Yeah, that's right. We didn't finish explaining the Rambam's two verses. We explained the Mishnah's verse. The Mishnah says, "You tell your son, Hashem did for me when I left Egypt." And that brings out, first of all, the reality. The Exodus is ongoing. And then we explain why the Alter Rebbe adds and then the Rambam both add the verse, "You shall remember," which brings us to the second point. There's an obligation. You have to remember this, which the Mishnah doesn't say. And we also said why the Alter Rebbe omits the word, "You should tell your son on that day," saying, because then you might think that it's only during the reciting the Haggadah, and it's not. It's during everything of the Seder nights. That's why he omits those words. We didn't get into yet why the Rambam brings this first verse. The Rambam brings the verse, "He took us out of there." We didn't actually explain that yet. And why the Alter Rebbe deviates from the Rambam. We didn't explain that yet either. Okay, so I guess we're going to do that now. Okay, according to Rambam's version, the verse that you should tell your son does not appear in the Mishnah. So the answer is simply that there are different versions of the Mishnah, right? The Rambam had a different version of the Mishnah that we have. So in the Rambam's version of the Mishnah, it doesn't say the verse you should tell your son. The Rambam therefore quotes the verse, "He took us out of there." Okay, you guess in the Rambam's Mishnah, it doesn't quote which verse. It just says the law. And now it relies on you to find your own verse. So the Rambam says, okay, I found my own verse. The verse I found says, "He took us out of there." And based on that, it follows then that there is no proof that one must consider that he left Egypt in the same fashion of the original Exodus. Okay, so that means he took us out of there. The difference between "you should tell your son" and where are we over here? Okay, let's go to the verses. Let's go to the sources over here. Here's the Mishnah. "You should tell your son on that day, saying, it's because of this which the Lord did for me that I came out of Egypt." Okay, from here it implies that you have to tell your son that this is what God did for me. That means every night, every Seder night, the son asks the 4 questions, you answer, you tell your son, it's because of this that God did for me when I left out of Egypt. That means I have to be feeling and demonstrating the Seder, celebrating the Seder night the same way they did it in Egypt. It's because of this that God did for me when I left Egypt. Because of this Seder night that I'm doing now, similar to the way I left Egypt. That's what the Mishnah implies from this verse. The problem is the Rambam's version of the Mishnah didn't have this verse. So therefore, the Rambam comes up with a different verse. He says he brought us out from there, so that he may bring us to the land he promised the forefathers to give to us. Here's the Rambam also. He took us out from there. He took us out from there means, okay, I have to remember that we left Egypt. He took us out from there. but it doesn't mean I have to celebrate it in the same manner that they left Egypt with. All right, that's the difference between the verse the Rambam says he took us out from there, and the verse that the Mishnah says and the Alter Rebbe quotes, which implies that you have to celebrate it in the same manner. So the Rambam's version doesn't include that verse, and therefore it follows he holds that you don't need to celebrate it in the same exact manner that they did in Egypt. The Alter Rebbe accepts the common version of the Mishnah, which includes the verse you should tell your son, Hashem did for me. This implies that one must consider as if you left Egypt in the same manner as the original Exodus. Why is that? How do we see that in the verse? For the words Hashem did for me refer to the Father. That only he, because he was in Egypt, could feel the Exodus. And this verse refers to future generations, which means that in the future generations, one must feel as if he left Egypt in the same manner as the original Exodus. That means in every generation, there's going to be a father that's going to say to their son, it's because of this that Hashem did for me when I left Egypt. So I left Egypt. I feel like I left Egypt. I'm demonstrating it in the same way that we left Egypt. And this is what we're doing now by the Seder night. That's how we see it from the verse. So this verse that the Mishnah says, according to the version of the Alter Rebbe, implies that you do need to celebrate it in the same manner. Therefore, in addition to the words of as if you yourself were a slave, the Alter Rebbe adds in Egypt. You see, the Rambam says here there's actually another difference that we didn't even point out. Okay. The Rambam says, remember that you were a slave, i.e., as if you were a slave, and went out to freedom and were redeemed. It doesn't say you were a slave in Egypt. Why? Because according to the Rambam, there's no mitzvah to feel like you left Egypt in the same manner. There's no mitzvah to remember in the same exact way that you left Egypt. No, you have to remember this general idea of slavery. You have to remember that you were a slave and now you're being free. That's the idea according to the Rambam. And however, it may be in a different way than the way they did when they left Egypt. You have to remember this idea of freedom. But the Alter Rebbe says, and you should remember that you were a slave in Egypt, i.e., as if you yourself were a slave in Egypt. Okay, so here's a fourth difference. We didn't mention this in the beginning of this extra word in Egypt. The Alter Rebbe says in Egypt because according to the verse that the Alter Rebbe brings, which is the same verse of the Mishnah, you have to feel it in the same manner as they left Egypt with. The same idea of freedom from slavery in Egypt, that's the type of freedom that you have to celebrate in Pesach. Okay, so that answers all the questions in the different verses according to the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe, and the Mishnah, and all the different distinctions. Now to end off, we have a little Chassidus over here. There are two distinct concepts: Cherus, freedom, and Pedia, release. Okay, so in the Talmud, there's two ideas of freedom, synonyms, which is release. You have like releasing captives, for example, is the greatest mitzvah of tzedakah to release a captive. It comes from that word pedia, pidyon shavuim. So that's one concept of freedom, of releasing. And then there's the concept of cherus. It's another word of freedom. So what's the difference between freedom and release? It's two separate things. In fact, in the Yovel, the Jubilee year, they occur at two different times. The cherus, the freedom, occurs on Rosh Hashanah, while the pedia, when the slave actually leaves the domain of the master, happens on Yom Kippur. So the freedom is when you're granted freedom. The release is when you can actually leave. We have this with the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, when he was. We celebrate the holiday of his freedom from imprisonment in Soviet Russia. We celebrate on 2 days: the 12th of Tammuz and the 13th of Tammuz. Why? After he was sentenced to death, which was, and then it was, what's the word I forgot? It was brought to a lower level of 10 years of harsh labor, and that was again lower. What was that? Commuted, thank you. And that was again commuted to 3 years of exile. So after a couple of weeks of exile, then on the 12th of Tammuz, he was notified of his freedom. He was a free person. However, there was a technical difficulty, and the offices of the KGB were closed because it was a national holiday. So he couldn't actually go free until he got the paperwork. So therefore, the next day, on the 13th of Tammuz, he was actually able to go get the paperwork and actually leave. So the 12th of Tammuz we celebrate as the freedom, and the 13th of Tammuz is the release. That's when he actually left. There's two different ideas. There's the idea of the slaves in the Jubilee year become free. In Torah law, it's also 2 different days. The freedom is on Rosh Hashanah, whereas the release is on Yom Kippur. So, the Rambam, who says that the obligation is to see himself as being freed from slavery in general, right? He doesn't mention the words in Egypt. He says the mitzvah is not, you don't have to do it in the same manner as Egypt. He quotes the verse to tell you to be free from slavery in general. So he writes that when you went out free lecherus, v'nifdisa, and you will released, which is the usual order of freedom. First you become free, and then you become released. Right? That's the way things work. First he is freed, and then he leaves the home of his master. That's how it worked. That's how you have to feel, that you were first released, freed, and then released. The Alter Rebbe, however, says that one must consider that he was released in the same manner as the original Exodus. Therefore, the Alter Rebbe changes the order and writes, "V'nivdisa you were released, and you were freed." So here's a fifth case. It's not the Chassidus, but I thought it was Chassidus. So it's not. It's a fifth difference. If you look carefully, that we're explaining now. A fifth difference between the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe. Now let's go to the source sheet. Okay, so the Rambam says, and where a slave went out to freedom and were redeemed, right? First you went out of freedom, and then you were redeemed. Redeemed is released, and then you were released. L'cheirus v'nevdisa. First cheirus, and then v'nevdisa. That's the normal manner of how things work in general. And that's because the Rambam is talking about, in general, you have to feel like you're going free, in general. Not from Egypt specifically, but in general going free. And that's the normal manner of going free. Now, the Rebbe says, as if yourself were a slave in Egypt and were redeemed and granted freedom. He changes the order. First, he says you were redeemed, v'nevdisa, and then v'yatzasa lacheres, and then granted freedom. Why did he switch it around? Excuse me. Thank you. And then, so why did he switch it around? So this is because in the land of Egypt, there was no possibility for freedom, as no slave could escape from there. Only when they left Egypt and arrived at Pia Chiros, once they were separated in Evdisa, could they then be free Chiros. So in Egypt, it was a unique idea. In general, it doesn't work this way. In general, first you are freed, and then you can leave, and then you're released. But in Egypt, there's no such thing as freedom. There is no freedom. Freedom doesn't exist in Egypt. So the way it worked with the Jewish people is when did the freedom occur? Only after they were released. Stop. Little Mendel is, he wants some milk. Okay.
My mother used to say a trumbenik.
Yeah. So, in Egypt, there's no such thing as freedom. It's impossible to escape. So when were they only free? Only after they escaped, in actuality. Only after they were actually released. And they were separated from the Egyptians. When they arrived at the Pia Chiros, which was at the border of Egypt, and they left physically Egypt. In other words, it's impossible to leave Egypt until you do. That's the way it worked. So once they left Egypt, once they were released, then they were able to actually be free. Otherwise, they were not free. They were never actually really free. Even when Egypt said, Pharaoh said you can go, they still weren't free. And the proof is, because like a few days later, they started chasing after them, and they wanted them back. So there was no freedom. The freedom only occurred after they actually left, and that's why the Alter Rebbe switches around the words, since the obligation that we have to feel is the same manner as when they left Egypt, And since when they left Egypt, first came, it changed the order as usual. The first came released, and then freedom. That's why the Alter Rebbe says in that order that first they were released and redeemed, and only then were they free. Okay, so now that's the end of the Sikha and all the different textual changes and the different sources of the Mishnah, the Rambam, and the Alter Rebbe.